Now, a discussion on the public affairs industry and digital technologies. This is part of a conference on politics and the Internet, hosted by George Washington University. It's just over an hour.
All right, thanks for coming to the panel. We're going to get started now so folks could take their seats. And we're aiming to make this something other than just a workshop. This should be a conversation. So if folks want to move closer, it might be easier to grab a mic or share a mic. And feel free to interrupt as we proceed. Wanted to start with the subject, picking up where Clay Johnson left off yesterday, on how a bill really becomes a law. So moving beyond the Schoolhouse Rock video, where you have a singing bill and it's introduced and it gets signed by the president at the end of the day, and what a lot of us here on the panel think about every day is the broader picture of legislative efforts on the Hill, and why priorities are set in a congressional agenda. So we'll discuss coalitions, we'll discuss public affairs or issue advocacy throughout the panel. And my name is Ben Clark. I work at Fleischman Hillard. I got my start in politics on Governor Dean's campaign. I helped build out the digital operations for the Washingtonian, and I've been doing new media consulting for several years. So I'll turn it to Michael Bassick to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Michael Bassick, and I was going to offer anybody the highest bidder, Claire McCaskill's water glass, coffee, and espresso to finish. You can see me afterwards. I work at Air America, which is a wildly profitable and successful airline started by Al Franken. I'm the new Chief Digital Officer. And you may have heard me explain this before, but I'm new, so if you go to the website now, I had nothing to do with it. It's pretty bad. But stick around. This summer, we're going to be launching a really fantastic vision for Air America that we hope will be entertaining, provocative, relevant, with an independent voice that we hope becomes a really important news and opinion destination for progressives across the country. Look forward to talking to you guys about public affairs.
John?
So I'm John Wonderlich. I'm Policy Director for the Sunlight Foundation. We're a DC-based nonprofit, and we are working out and in some cases inventing the ways that digital technology is going to change how government and often advocacy work.
I'm Bill Black with Fleischman Hillard. I'm the co-chair of the Global Public Affairs Practice. I've been with Fleischman for about almost 13 years now, but before that was at the American Medical Association, where I launched the first public affairs website for the AMA, and before that worked on Capitol Hill for 14 years for various members of Congress. I started my career in Washington as the computer operator for an obscure freshman member of Congress named Barney Frank. So that's where I am today.
I'm Pat Cleary, Senior VP of Digital Public Affairs at Fleischman. Michael, actually, I think Air America lost my bags. Maybe you can see.
Yes, I can talk to you about that after.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've been at Fleischman for 2 years. Before that, I was at the National Association of Manufacturers for 10 years in a series of policy and public affairs slots, and finished up as Senior VP of Communications. And while there, I started a blog called shopfloor.org, which, despite my best efforts, grew.
So for those of us who are advocates, and you can see on this table it's a lot of strategists, we are, and those in the room, we know that there's a finite amount of resources and time for those on the Hill. And as we all compete for priorities, it's obviously important to have an honest debate. And so I want to turn to John and see if, does Sunlight Foundation feel right now that there's an honest debate, and if not, what needs to happen?
I think we're certainly entering a time of not just honest debate, but a new time of proactive transparency. If you look through the reforms of the last 200 years, usually requirements like the Ethics in Government Act or the Freedom of Information Act were a response to a situation of gross corruption. And what we're seeing now is the internet creating a new kind of expectations that governments are being forced to respond to try to keep up. They aren't keeping up, but they're starting to learn how to keep up, both in Congress, in the executive branch, and in states. Illinois is undertaken a radical thing. This is probably for a different reason that Illinois has to try to become less corrupt. But Illinois, Florida, Texas, Missouri, a lot of cities are all reinventing what they look like on the internet because there's a new kind of expectation that they have. And so I think one of the new things that we're seeing is a proactive push towards transparent and reactive government.
So when you say, as you say often, public means online, in what context and why is that true?
So a lot of disclosure requirements will say this form or this set of information needs to be public. And the way in practice that works is that if you go to the Ways and Means Committee on a Wednesday between 2:30 and 3, then you can ask for a binder that you can then inspect if you fill out a form. And in practice, there will be 5 people ever that do that, and 4 of them are probably people working for commercial publishers that are going to then pay for that information. And in a world where we expect information to be available from our computers, from our living rooms, from our cell phones, that physical process of going somewhere doesn't cut it at all. It's actually the opposite of transparency. So for us, when something should be public, it should also be required to be posted online and available for free for anyone to access.
So, Bill, as a former chief of staff, 2 questions. One is that realistic, and 2, the inverse. Like from your position as someone who has to provide accurate information to, a member, how do you sort out, quality information and real constituency feedback?
I think it's eminently realistic to expect that kind of transparency. I think the technology is clearly there, and we see commercial interest. If there is a commercial interest in doing it, it gets done. The question is if there's a public interest, and if then there's a resource question as to how many resources you're going to devote to that. But clearly, technically, I can remember in the early days of my career, when I was working for a candidate and the FEC reports would come out, having to go down to the FEC physically and sit there and copy a page at a time the FEC reports of all your opponents, and it was a profound waste of time. And I don't even know how far they've come in terms of that. I mean, I do know that there are some third parties that provide very good access to that kind of data. But that it's there, and there has to be it has to be people like John around forcing it to happen, because it's not the path of least resistance for public officials to do that. From my experience working in a congressional office, I mean, that is clearly a challenge, and it was fascinating listening to the previous panel, because they're saying the same things that were said 15 years ago about in the way to best influence a member of Congress, and it's always been about authenticity. When I first started, as I said, with Barney Frank, this was 1981, when the man who this building was named after was elected in a landslide. The big technological breakthrough was postcards, and we would have to deal with this avalanche of postcards that would come into the office. And Barney, in those days, really felt as though he could intellectually engage with every person that communicated with his office in a way that would turn them around. So we would have these essentially hostile people sending in postcards saying, do whatever Ronald Reagan says to do, and that's all I want to hear. And he had a 3-page letter that he dictated that every single one of those thousands of people had to get. And of course, in those days, we didn't have laser printers. We had daisy wheels, which were these kind of things that would be rattling constantly all day. We fried printer after printer after printer, satisfying Barney's demand that every one of these postcards get a 3-page letter. Then dawn broke. We said, what are we doing? Because then they would get that 3-page letter. It would make them twice as mad, and they would send in then something else to they would be enraged by the letter. And so we learned that you just don't answer. The hostile mail, or certainly hostile postcards, didn't need a response. And so as I kind of saw the way grassroots have evolved over my career here, there was that period where quantity ruled, because members of Congress would be spooked by the vast numbers of these postcards or analogous kinds of communications coming in, and it would actually influence them and scare them into voting Reagan's way in a lot of cases, not in Barney's case, I hope you could understand. But then it became a point where you didn't have to answer everyone, and then quality kind of took over. But then there were problems with that, and this happened after I was in Barney's office. But there was a time when there was this one particularly nasty constituent who wrote every single week, and Barney told the staff people, do not answer this guy anymore. I've had it with him. I'm not going to communicate with him. So they put into his record, do not answer this constituent's mail. Unfortunately, they put it in the address to field. So the next mass mailing that went out, this guy got a letter that said, do not respond to this guy's mail. So that staff member didn't last long. But then there became a quality movement where you knew that the only way you were going to get the attention of the member of Congress is with 10 high-quality letters from legitimate community leaders were more valuable than 1,000 postcards.
And so on that, if when that was realized by those of us on the table or out there who do issue advocacy, it's pretty much a campaign model, right? So there'd be a campaign manager, focus group.
Well, it would change the way you would
messages.
Communicate, with members. And then, I think, and just to kind of close the point, I think what's happened with technology is you've kind of had the marriage of quality and quantity, because you do have now the ability to both educate and find genuine, authentic advocates for your position within congressional districts and mobilize them to communicate into members of Congress. And so I think, at least in theory, the quality of the exchange of information has improved, but as you heard from the previous panel, it's still not quite there.
Right. So Pat, you've been, consulting groups on how to, influence folks like Bill.
I was in the Reagan administration sending those postcards.
So how have things changed? If what John and Bill are saying is true, and there's kind of a new age thanks to digital. As a practitioner, we don't all have Obama in our back pocket, and we don't have this presidential election to necessarily motivate action online. So how does you worked at National Association of Manufacturers, how does NAM or another group use those technologies to advocate?
Yeah, and before I address that, great lines from Barney Frank, would fill a room if you wrote them down there. He's got so many, but during one of the last big outrages when everybody hated Congress in the 90s, somebody asked Barney and said, well, everybody, hates Congress. And he said, have you seen the voters these days? They're no bargain either. So, a great line. It was very funny. So, it captured what all of us thought, but really couldn't say. So, I think from my prism, which is the association world, for most of the last 10 or 15 years, in a city that is balkanized and siloed, so you have the National Association of and the American Academy of, that you have these great silos. That what social media has allowed us to do is organize around issue. Now that strikes all of you as sort of a big duh moment, but I think from the association world, they're still grappling with that. And we just finished an assignment for the for a group of home builders, not for the home builders, for a group of home builders called Fix Housing First. Growing a coalition from 5 companies to 2,500 companies around an issue. Should there be a tax credit that allows home buyers, any home buyer, tax credit for any home buyer? So, and so it was an issue that people rallied around. And so we got people who were members of, the National Association of Home Builders, the National Association of Realtors, the National Association of Manufacturers, right? And this is a city where, again, all those things would have been balkanized or still are balkanized today, but this became an army. 20,000 people got our emails. This is in a span of 3 months. 50,000 people took action, 180,000 letters to the Hill, because they're organized around an issue. So I think what this has changed, and again, it sounds obvious to all of you, but not so obvious to, I think, the association community today, people in the world today who tend to think, and Ben and I met with one last week, who's kind of in the mindset, why would I mobilize all these people who aren't my members? We said, well, you'd only do it if you wanted to win. If you don't want to win, then don't bother pestering these people, right? That I think what's happened is, at least in this city, from the business community side, is a sort of an awakening to organize people around issues that defy associations.
And Basak, playing off of that, maybe on your previous incarnation as a consultant, if you could talk about one or two scenarios where loss of control or embrace of technology allowed for real people to kind of meet their members in a new forum.
Sure. I could give a few. I usually try to talk in like lesson points. So one of them I'll sort of mention is the concept of making it really local and making it tangible. Right now, I think if you work on Capitol Hill, you're probably inundated with emails every day and don't really know, are these emails from my district? Should I really care about these 10,000 emails that came in on this issue? And what we need to do as consultants and as practitioners is help our clients and help organizations make their advocacy online sort of tangible. So, for example, we were working with the Kellogg Foundation. I say we when I used to work at MSHC Partners here in D.C. With the Kellogg Foundation to help insert a provision in the Farm Bill that would have allowed for more funding of locally grown sustainable food. And we targeted various members of the Agriculture Committee and advertised into their districts and did communications into their districts, and we had a petition for each district. And once we got 100 signatures that triggered an email to a specific member's office, once we hit 100, we would go to that district. We would collect locally grown goods from local farmers markets in that district, created a basket of these local goods, and we'd hand deliver these local goods to each member's office with the list of the 100 people who had signed the online petition. And most of it was done through the mail. We'd actually go to the district, and each item had to be non-perishable and I think like under $3 or something like that. But what we did was we took what would have normally been just an email that hit someone's inbox, and we made it tangible, made it real. So certainly one way to avoid just being completely beholden to technology is to make those you're trying to influence realize there are real people behind these actions.
And if I could just add to that, you started by saying we need to help clients and help organizations. I think as the kind of effective spokesman for the Hill staff, even though I haven't worked there for 15 years, you also want to help them. And I think this is one way to do it. It makes it more tangible. It does have an impact, and it's a great way to go. But there's also other ways of helping organizations communicate transparently to members of Congress. And right now, I just want to put in a plug for a report that I'm embarrassed to say I only looked at in preparation for this panel, and I wished I'd seen it sooner. But the Congressional Management Foundation, which is on this in the program somewhere, has this great thing that if we did it at Fleischman Hillard, we'd probably have charged $10,000 to a client, but it's free online, and it talks about the best way that we should all just kind of have a pact, both the organizers and the Hill staff, so that we kind of know what we're doing. The Hill staff aren't fooled. They know what's going on. When you have an organized grassroots email campaign, they see it instantly. And why not just be open about it? Because in the end, all it's going to end up as a tally list for the member of Congress. We got this many on this issue, and we got this many on the other side. And if you can just help them process the information. I can remember when I left the Hill, it was just as email was kind of coming in, and there was a panic. Because the members of Congress and their staff thought, oh my God, another porthole through which the shit can pour into our office that we don't know how to deal with it. Whereas I saw it, I'm happy to say, enlightened guy that I am, as an opportunity because it allows an opportunity to kind of hand it off. But it's to build lists that you can kind of actually, you'll have a great list of people, at least the people that support you on issues. Well, what CMF recommends is that just contact the members and say, we got a grassroots thing coming, we got it in this format, here's how you can import it into your system, and it'll just make for an easier kind of exchange of information for all around. So CMF, go to the website, get this report. It's very, very good.
Talking about that grassroots army mentality, how do we as strategists mobilize? Again, if we're not Obama, if we're not, in this a moment of how do you make something urgent? Jump in.
If you can't create a parade, get in front of one. It's probably the best advice I could give to that specific question. If you don't have Barack Obama and you don't have some other ability to get your message out to tens of thousands or more people, you need to latch on to some type of current event and become the relevant expression of that event. For example, during the S-chip debate, when Bush vetoed the S-chip bill, Families USA, I see Julia Eisman in the audience, said, "This is our time. There is probably not going to be another time when the media is so up in arms over children's health insurance." And they immediately went into action. They created television ads, they created online ads, they had a tremendous online campaign. So when you can't get Obama behind you, sort of get in front of the parade.
And the messaging, and obviously it was a successful campaign from your perspective. Was there, to the extent of mobilizing activists, how did the messaging change, from 10 years ago? Like, was it, an inclusive kind of call to action? Was it about urgency? Like, how did you connect with folks? Was it different? Did the online ads look different than the television ads?
Actually, not really.
Yeah.
It was a very, and I think this is sort of what you're starting to see across the board, is that there isn't anymore just sort of this, we're going to do a television ad and then we're going to do a print ad and maybe we'll do something online. It's all planned at the same time. And that's why you see a lot of organizations taking their television ads, putting them on YouTube, and then streaming them in banner ads, and then sending them out in email and getting people to take action around this television ad. So you're starting to see more people making a consistent effort.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with Michael too. It's a different way of saying never waste a good crisis, right? Like Rahm Emanuel says.
Never waste a good crisis.
And you see it a lot nowadays with the economic issues, right? And that was the thing. Again, back to the home builders example, they said, look, here's what we want. We're looking for a tax credit and a buy down of the interest rate. We said, what makes you think it will work? And they said, look, here's this graph from the 70s. And it was one of those perfect graphs, right? We all live in this world. It's hard. You see these graphs sometimes, these jagged teeth. You're like, what the hell am I looking at? So this graph went like this. It was beautiful. And so it was the economy going in the tank in the 70s. And right at the very bottom, Congress passed this, a tax credit and to buy down the interest rate. And the economy goes right back up again. It's terrific. So the same type of thing is like, and even the name of the coalition, Fix Housing First. It was like, housing led us into this decline. And if we can turn that around and sort of fix that, and obviously these are people who otherwise qualified, right? This wasn't throwing good money after bad. That housing picks up, people buy more boards and carpet and appliances, and then the price of everybody's home comes back up, and there's more equity and blah blah blah. That it was trying to get a piece of the economic crisis and say yes, and to harness that, as Michael said, to harness that, to say everybody's worried, like, what the hell do we do? How do we get out of this thing? It's like, well, here's something. And, I think to some degree tried to get in front of that parade. And again, with Congress spending, nearly $1 trillion, we only needed a little bit of that parade. And
John,
that worked out.
See, he's always on message. So if you want to send a message to Congress in support of a tax credit for home builders, we'll give you the website.
We'll come back and get another.
So when I hear all this talk about the mobilizing, maybe it's because I come at it from a different perspective, but I would rather hear the term empower. Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder if the sense in which we organize and do advocacy comes, if you think about when Gingrich came to power and hollowed out a lot of the support mechanisms that Congress had, like the member organizations or the Office of Technology Assessment, or the things that really let members of Congress do their job on the basis of substance and merit. That got hollowed out, and then suddenly organizing became about these, how many postcards did you get? Right. It was knocked down like 7 notches in terms of how much substance there was there.
Sure.
So if I wonder if our sense of mobilizing people is something we've actually inherited from an institution that has lost its ability to deal with substance. And I think that kind of echoes Tim Ryan's point from the earlier panel when he said we need resources in order to have a couple more staff members. That he was talking about engaging with public school students, but I can imagine, I'm sure we can all imagine any number of things that we wish congressional offices could do better. I mean, one of the ones at the top of my list would be getting an inbox that's over 150 megabyte limit, which is pretty absurd if you think about free services. I don't know how many gigs you get now on Gmail, but 150 megabytes is pretty small. Send 2 attachments and you'll shut down Congress. So. That's a resource problem.
I'm sorry. That's such a great point. I met with a bunch of corporate folks last week an enormous company that you all would recognize, and they said they've got 2 people doing, doing social media. They're all over the globe, a huge, very well recognized brand name. And then they got like thousands of people doing I don't know what, right. And it's like, well, what's everybody else doing? It's like, well, they're doing their TSP reports. Like, well, that's fantastic. Stop the TSP reports and shift everybody over. But I think John makes a good point. It's like, okay, if people, it's like, well, we're sorry we can't open these attachments, right? Because we're manning the fax machine. It's like, step away from the fax machine and start looking at where people are.
To John's point, if we inherited, as practitioners, a language that is from, I think there is a difference between, what we'd call paid media and shared media, and if folks here could talk a second about when you do play on social networks, or you do have a staff that's equipped or empowered, to use John's language, to talk to people in real time and provide the expertise that those of us inside the Beltway have in terms of knowing when a bill is up. I know for Fixed Housing First there was this use of Twitter. Pat, if you could talk, Bill, maybe talk about that. I think it takes a television ad telling you about an issue and why you should care and why you should go to a website has completely different language than a Twitter account where it's trying to engage and or empower folks in an issue they already care about.
Yeah, I always say I wasn't a big Twitter fan because I didn't really get it or understand why anybody cared what the hell I was doing. So with this coalition, we started a Twitter feed in the last week, right before the vote on the stimulus bill. And so I spent 20 years probably as a lobbyist. So I've been on both sides of that. But what was so great, and so I boldly assert that this is the first time Twitter is used in a legislative fight, and if that's not true, please keep it to yourself. That it was so great because, and those of you who have lobbied or been involved in those sorts of things, it's such a bubble down there. It was so great for our lobbyists, just in real time, to just be on the main site, fixedhousingfirst.com, to look at it, just to see exactly what was going on. And again, Ben and I have talked to other clients since then, other associations who've said, oh, our lobbyists would never want to do that. It's like, well, this was public information. They were just making public information available before everybody else had it. And so what happened? That site became this huge magnet for anybody who was following the bill. And so you'd come to the site, you'd see the absolute up-to-the-second updates, and then in between we would tweet, here's the link to weigh in. And it was great. So we started Twitter, on a Wednesday, and we had 300 followers in the first day, which we thought was pretty good. And we put 10,000 letters to Capitol Hill that day, and then the following day, 20,000 letters to Capitol Hill. So, and the only thing that changed was the Twitter feed. So in a legislative fight, it was great. It was fantastic. I mean, it's a great tool.
Yeah, and I think just to get to John's point about empowering, I think that's one of the ways that it's going to knock down barriers, and it is going to empower people. And as Pat points out, most of the traditional lobbyists look with horror at the idea that information can be dispersed beyond their kind of precious place. And for them, information is power, and why would you give it away? But I think there is a benefit, clearly, when you do give it away, this information. And in fact, I had one little Twitter anecdote, which I kind of educated me on it as well, is I went to a fundraiser for my old boss, Steny Hoyer. I also worked for Steny. And that's where I learned that the bill was going to be delayed under consideration in the Senate because Senator Sherrod Brown's mother had died, and he was going to have to leave to go to Ohio, and they needed every single vote, so the bill was going to be delayed. Now, this would be news the next day, but at 7 o'clock that evening, I broke the story on Twitter, and the only people that knew about it were the people in the Fixed Housing First community. And so what you're able to do with these tools is essentially create your own private news network of supporters. But everybody along that continuum has to be transparent, has to be open, and that's not the case yet. And so I think the more enlightened organizations whose lobbyists recognize the positive power at their fingertips and don't think in the old way that if I know this information, that gives me more power than the other guy, I think then we're going to, that's another way to help advocates make the best use of these things.
I was just going to say, part of being able to empower people means that you are actively engaging them throughout the year, all the time, and public affairs is a constant effort. It's not just something you can decide to do when you launch a new issue. It's easier to start with a group of people who are already invested and have already signed up or have already vocalized some support for the overarching cause. And that's why I'd encourage everyone to constantly be listening to and engaging with those people who are raising their hands and saying, I am already interested in what you have to say. And because we're on the topic of Twitter, I'll talk a little bit about how Air America uses Twitter to do just that, and how we also use other means of communicating. There are about 4 of us at Air America who use a piece of software called TweetDeck, which is free, and I encourage you all to download it, which enables us to have a dashboard management system of Twitter. And we are able, in real time, to identify anybody in the Twitterverse who mentions Air America, who mentions Anna-Marie Cox, who might still be, she was there a minute ago, who is an Air America personality, who mentions any of our shows. And we're able to determine whether or not they mentioned it positively, negatively, if they asked a question. And what we do is we add these individuals to a database, and we communicate back and forth with them on Twitter. And therefore, when they say to us over Twitter, damn, I'm so upset that Air America is no longer carried in Sacramento, the second that we go back up with an affiliate in Sacramento, we're able to go back to these individuals and say, guess what, you spoke and we heard you and now we're back up in Sacramento. We do the same thing with those who email us. Anyone who emails comments at airamerica.com gets a personal response. We get over 2,000 incoming emails a week, let alone those individuals who actually comment on our website. Get a personal response, and it's all categorized. It's categorized in terms of what they were complaining about or what they were saying positively. If they're commenting on a specific show, we forward that along to the specific show's producers. If they say that they're a real big fan, or perhaps they were a fan and they're not anymore, we'll give them an opportunity to come to our office and tell us why. And we'll give them a tour of the Air America studios, and we'll spend 15, 20 minutes having coffee with them. And that way, when we need them, when we want to mobilize them to tell a station to carry the show or to tune in for something, they're already there. They're already part of our network. And I'll tell you, it's so easy to organize these individuals on your behalf if you're already and constantly listening to them.
So, on that subject and others, we're all talking about the right way, the power of this this medium, and I think the gorilla in the room, post Jack Abramoff or prior, or for those who are fans of the movie, Thank You for Smoking. We can look at the tobacco industry as prime. They used AstroTurf technology, right? They pretended to have coalitions, and we see in the news that there are folks who buy email lists of seniors and or other constituents and use them as part of their coalition and kind of manufacture, take a shortcut. So, let's not pretend that doesn't exist or that's not, still prevalent in the industry. So the question is, why does this new model, and I understand, from either if you're a media company or whatever, why does the new model trump the old? Why is Air America's approach a little bit better than maybe Charlie Rose, where you have to be, an important person to sit down and there isn't this community element?
Real people trump purchased lists. I mean, I think that's pretty clear, and I think it's something we probably have learned. I imagine those of you in the room who work at a coalition or who have consulted with coalitions or work on Capitol Hill have come across, over the past, let's say, 10 years, the question of, should we buy a list? Should we buy an email list? And I can almost guarantee that all of you have found that if you bought a list of 1 million people, it probably was not nearly as effective of the list of 500 people that you grew organically who were human beings who had email addresses and phone numbers, and you could mobilize them or empower them when the issue that they're already passionate about came up.
So if, maybe there's some examples people can talk about, if you've decided to loosen the control, and you're willing to engage in, a little bit more risk and talk to real people as opposed to having a manufactured list. And, John, or anyone here who has an example of a reward, like you did that and you got, beyond constituent feedback, maybe it was a piece of culture that was produced or...
So that's something that I think my organization, the Sunlight Foundation, does a lot. And part of that is because of the organizational culture that we have, but we take a lot of risks, and we do a lot of our work online. I often know what my boss, Ellen Miller, is doing because I follow her Twitter feed. and she's 5 steps down the hall from me, but we interact often via Twitter. Clay Johnson, the director of the Sunlight Labs, has the same thing. He has a tweet deck up, and it's basically taking up his entire second 24-inch monitor with 8 saved searches for all the keywords that he's tracking. So in
that sense, you're using it as a focus group, right? Like you're kind of in real-time focus group, searching Twitter for...
Right. What feedback are we getting yesterday on the Apps for America winners that were announced, or whatever it is? There's always something going on. But then, in terms of organizing or doing advocacy, we've done a lot of that too. So I helped with the Open House project, which was about, I organized it, which was about recommendations for transparency in the House of Representatives. One of the sections there was about reforming the rules about how members of Congress can use the internet. And while that was being changed, we whipped up in the course of like 8 hours a Twitter-based campaign to allow people to sign a petition on Twitter by retweeting a message that says, change the way that you govern that. And that was a risk. We did the same thing with Pass 482. It might have been 223 at the time, but it's a bill in the Senate saying that the Senate will file campaign finance reports electronically, which they don't do now. They do it on paper, which is just intentional obscurity. It's nothing else. It's just, if we do it on paper, you won't find out who's giving us money until after the election. So hopefully they pass it this Congress. But in connection with that, we did a Twitter lobbying campaign, which we got a little bit of pushback for because so many people were retweeting it and it started to look like noise. But we also got Claire McCaskill and I think it was Claire McCaskill. We got 2 senators to endorse or to become co-sponsors of the bill through the Twitter campaign. And we could have tried to have meetings with every member of Congress, but why is it that the private meeting is viewed as somehow more powerful than a public argument that people agree with? So we're
also this is a bill that you wrote, or you authored the bill as Sunlight, or how did that process work? Because if you think of, to go back to Clay Johnson's point yesterday on the panel of the bill is magically introduced, but clearly here's an example of you were the why, right? That this wasn't on their radar beforehand.
Well, so this bill in particular has been one that has come up repeatedly, and I don't even know when the first time it was introduced. It's one of those bills that someone introduces, and there's just not political will. And last Congress it almost passed, and there was a hold on it, and we rooted out the hold. And then this Congress, we're hopeful that it'll actually happen. Right. There are a lot of other cases where we've been the why, but not that one in particular.
Sure.
Yeah, and also, let me say, just again, to state the obvious, right, the beauty of real people is they stay in the fight. To Michael's point, you buy a list, if people still do that, and that's it. You fire that bullet once, that's it. But when you engage people, and they're tweeting and they're on Facebook and they're all these other and other networks that continue to drive your cause. And again, just because it's so recent and because we're so familiar with it, the Twitter feed on Fix Housing First is now at 700 and some people. Right, the bill's over, done, voted on, and that community lives on. So these are people who are engaging.
Are you still Twittering out to them?
Well, that's a great question. A little bit, and I think they're trying to get their brains around what have we got, right? And clearly, we keep saying to them, you can't just walk away from this because you've got this living organism out there. So, how the hell do we do this?
They being the client.
The client, yes, the client, not the Twitters. That's exactly right. So we keep trying to feed it. Give them a little.
So that's like a great strategy from a consulting perspective, is to create these tools that require ongoing maintenance.
Unintentionally, but true. Yeah.
So on the question of the panel,
if we get a mic back there too.
The title of the panel about real people. There's this question I have that I've been thinking about, and that's why is it so easy to detect authenticity online? You'd think it'd be really easy to fake, but people. I have personally the experience of it being very easy to tell if someone's engaging authentically or not.
Right.
And that's why things like John Culberson on Quick are so amusing, because it's him walking around talking to police officers in the Capitol, and
Right. This is a representative from Texas who's embraced Twitter and other technology.
And there's another example. Representative Buck McKeon got a new media staffer, and their first project was to buy a video camera and walk around the office. And he didn't tell any of his staff he was doing it. And he interviews the intern, he interviews the communications director, and it's unbelievably awkward. It's these employees of this member that are like, I don't know what you expect me to say to the constituents, so they all wave and say, hi, constituents. But it's also unbelievably authentic, because you're like, this is what it's like to be in the office.
It's the great line from Groucho Marx, right? That sincerity is everything, and if you can fake that, you've got it made.
Lindsay, if you... Sure.
Hi. Michael, you made this point about being out there and talking, and actually all of you have been talking about being there to use these new media to communicate advocacy, and it's so refreshing. I was just remembering 10 years ago when we were trying to do advocacy by going into what was the online equivalent of AOL chat rooms and the Usenet and other places, and even clearly identifying ourselves as we're part of an effort to push this forward, and not pretending we're something, but saying we want to do this. There was so much pushback that both there was in the community, the netizens or whatever, and in those actual chat rooms. It was like, stay the hell out of here.
Right. I think it's good because we I don't know if you have a question in particular, but
well, I mean, have we changed as a society? Has netizens changed? Are we only because we're Claire McCaskill and we're personally doing it that we get that?
No, it's because the internet is bigger now, and there's more self-selection, and there's more acceptance of commercial and advocacy messaging within these larger environments. So if I'm in a specific chat room, and it's like, M for F, I don't know, what did I used to go on, other high school, middle school buddy chat, want to share free software or something, I don't know.
I'm talking about appropriate political chats.
I think now, though, when people can go and identify themselves, I'm a fan of this candidate, I'm a fan of this organization, or I'm actively Twittering about the specific bill. You're putting yourself out there. You are raising your hand and saying, I am interested in this, and I want to have a conversation about this, and I want more information on it. Whereas in the past, if you were just in a chat room and you're talking about general politics, you don't want to hear from some corporation who wants you to believe a certain way. You want to have an authentic chat.
But I think that's a good point. Do you think there is still some pushback? I think we see, there are a lot of, not necessarily Sunlight, but there are a lot of watch groups that I think assume that any corporate or association effort that has the word lobbyist attached to it, and this is a brand problem that, I think most of us would agree lobbyists created for themselves. It's not something that the public, cooked up on their own. But, Pat, you've worked at, fairly, folks who are looked at hostilely for anything they do, right? By a certain, percentage of the community.
I never knew that, actually, until just now. It's amazing. Again, in that universe, this sort of deal with the devil of relinquishing some control for more payoff at the end in terms of engagement is still hard for certainly the majority, I would say, of associations and companies. It's hard.
But there's a group of people that you're probably never going to reach, or that need to be educated. I mean, have you found that if you do this kind of activity in a transparent manner, that you get less of that hostility, associated with lobbyists or, corporate efforts?
It's like everything else. Nothing succeeds like success. That if you can point to a success story and people see that, and companies can see that works, then they might be more inclined to do it. But my experience is that they do tend to see everything that can go wrong. Right? These are risk-averse groups. They see everything can go wrong rather than see what can go right. And there are some exceptions, but they're the exceptions.
Right, we've got another question back there.
Yeah. Can I just, I just want to make a point on that. I think that we have passed a tipping point, though, because there was, 2 years ago, all of our corporate clients, if you'd suggest a blog, they would just do one of these. No way, we can't afford to be there. And I think we've reached a point now where they recognize we can't afford not to be there. They still have the problem of control, and we have to advise them, you have to let go. You have to be willing to accept some criticism on your own website to give the thing credibility. And many can't take it that far, so what they're asking us to do is create a blog that doesn't have criticisms of them on there. And so, they still haven't kind of made it yet, but I do think we have crossed a line.
2 years into shopfloor.org, one of my colleagues said to me, Now, you don't post comments on there from people who disagree with you, do you? And I realized, first of all, that she had never looked at the blog, which is probably a good thing. But of course we did. Yeah.
Let's go to the question, Brad.
Hi, my name is Brad Fitch with Roll Call Group, and I want to ask a question that spins off of something Ben said about the authenticity of communications. There's this myth that has been pervasive in advocacy that people go out there and manufacture grassroots campaigns. The word's AstroTurf. And in full transparency, in the interest of transparency, I should identify that I was formerly with the Congressional Management Foundation and wrote the first report with Kathy Goldschmidt on communicating with Congress. And one of the fascinating things that the report that, Bill, you were showing that was amazing of that and the precursor is that according to a survey that CMF did last year, half of all adult Americans had contacted a member of Congress within the last 5 years. Right. Which was an amazing explosion in advocacy. And so my question is, have you in any of your research or any of your work detected any groups actually manufacturing lists? Because I know from the work that I did at CMF and now working at Capitol Advantage, which sends more communications to Capitol Hill than the U.S. Postal Service, that we haven't detected any. And is this not a myth? And is this explosion not just a result of technology, but isn't it a result of people just being more interested in what's going on in public affairs?
Yeah, I haven't seen it in our business. I mean, we are, I think, as a company, just ethically precluded from doing that sort of thing. So by definition, we haven't seen it because we haven't done it. But my favorite example of that was at one point, this is back in the postcard days, a member of Congress got a postcard from himself in support of a position that he did not hold. And I think that kind of, another one of those tipping points, when everybody saw that, it's gone too far. But I think you're right, and to point, Pat's point, other points that were made here, the way we build advocacy is essentially, and I hate to do a particular ad because this is an area I'm not completely familiar with, but I saw it happen, Google ads, those kind of context ads, the ability to be able to put a little ad up next to a news story that is on the issue that you're advocating for invites people in, and then so that kind of by definition is authentic because they have chosen to join your group as opposed to getting a list of likely supporters and then barraging them and trying to patch them through. I guess I would just validate the point from our experience.
But apparently the people are still doing it. There was a thing that made the rounds a couple of weeks ago of a firm here in town and a guy up in Massachusetts, a reporter who went and the
letter to the editors?
Yes.
Yeah. So people are still doing it. That's a head scratcher.
Well, you maybe should explain.
John, do you want to explain that, John?
There was a story in a Massachusetts newspaper sometime in the last week is when I saw it about they had received 3 or 5 letters to the editor, and the editor contacted the people who had reportedly written the letters, and they said, I have no idea about this issue. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never written a letter to the editor. So that came up, and then the other example I can think of and this comes directly from attending the conference in 2007 where CMF was preparing that report, and that was the first time I got an appreciation for staff and advocacy organizations and the gulf between them. I swear it was almost a fight at one point. It was very instructive to me. But the staffers would talk about hitting reply all or sending responses and getting bounce back messages from a higher percentage of the emails than one would expect it to. So that was the other piece of evidence that said some of them were manufactured. I don't want to take a position on it, but that's the story that was brought up in that context.
Sure.
Thanks for being up here today. I'm Carl Ecker. I actually work at the National Association of Home Builders, so I witnessed your efforts. One of the things I think our members don't know what a computer is for the most part, let alone Twitter. But one thing your stuff did do is get the media to talk about it, and that helped our in-person lobbying. Our guys are more focused on, I got the cell phone of the senator, but I'm not going to email him. Do you see that a lot with your more old white guy clients where they don't understand technology, but your efforts, the new media efforts, can bring the news media on board so that our traditional lobbying can help bring home the win?
Yeah, and as the ambassador to old white guys, myself, I can speak.
I resemble that
right. Bill's fighting for the title, the ambassador to old white. We're like the Sunshine Boys. I think that's right. But I still would say, that every day I'm astonished by how many old white guys are online, right? And that are like on Facebook or tweeting. And again, even in this case, Fixed Housing First, we had 300 people in day one astonished me. I thought if we got 20 people, I was going to be happy because of with the group we were speaking to. But who knew? So first of all, it's more than you think. At least that's been reinforced with me over and over again. But second of all, to the extent that it's not as much as you think, you're right. It does at least help create buzz. And at least in the case of blogs, for me with shopfloor.org, it was who was our major audience was people on the Hill and beat reporters. Right? That was great.
And the other thing I think is that just by the nature of the technology, the people that aren't online are probably not going to do much for you anyways. If they're that disengaged, then because I remember I ran an association for a while, and it got to the point where we would spend vast amounts of effort and money to communicate with the offline people. For a push of a button, you send emails to everybody who's online, and you got to fax. Do this mass fax, and so at some the return on investment in the offline community is shrinking. It seems to me because the online community is growing so large.
We could point you to the Pew Internet Life study that talks about generations online, and it's pretty proportionate representative of baby boomers percentage, of the general U.S. population. It pretty much matches online activity. Now, to your point, they're not on Twitter as much, but Facebook's fastest growing segment of the population is baby boomers. So, in other social networks and shared media, they are rising.
But in fairness to the question, that doesn't help him if we say everybody else is online, if his particular community is not online. So I'm feeling a little guilty for just saying, blowing you off. But
we got to go to this question here.
Hi, Emily Cadet with Congressional Quarterly. And I guess this sort of plays off the last question, which is, with there's such a rise in online advocacy, is there still a place for kind of these big ad campaigns, like we're seeing Clean Coal just run big ads and on cable news buys? How do you integrate those two strategies, or are those going to become obsolete as you can begin to do more and more micro targeting online?
What is it? Half of your, I know that half of my, what was the quote? Half of my advertising works. I just don't know which half it is. There's no way, without probably spending a tremendous amount of time and effort and research, to know whether or not on a particular issue you should be doing television and radio or just internet. I think what we found is that none of these media work in a vacuum. If you're just going to do television, you're SOL. If you're just going to do internet, you're also SOL. You need to be doing this together. And there is no substitute for an in-person meeting with a member of Congress. There is no substitute for a personal letter or a phone call. These are, as we get and talk about authenticity, and I'll try to be very quick, but as we talk about authenticity, the internet is making it easier to be inauthentic and to be authentic. When you see Oprah tweeting this past week in all caps, "Hello, Twitterverse, it's Oprah, I'm here," you say, you know what? That's freaking authentic. That is Oprah on Twitter, all caps. That's authentic. But at the same time, I could have gone on my own and said, on Twitter, create an account called I'm the Real Oprah, and pretended to be her. So I think there still has to be that connection to the offline world to make, we can't just be hiding behind our computers. Ultimately, Congress needs to know that these are individual people, and it comes across in all media.
Yeah, also, just from the association perspective, what I would say about huge ad campaigns is sometimes the biggest audience is your members, right? And the members go like, "Yeah, now we're talking. Look at that, it's beautiful, and it's terrific." And that makes them happy because everybody wants an advocate in Washington for whatever it is they do. And so it makes the members very happy, and I don't mean to dismiss that. That's important.
Place local newspaper ads thanking your member of Congress or your senators for their support of a bill in the local newspaper. That thanking act is so superior to any television ad you could put up.
Absolutely agree.
I think there's another question, Lindsay. Sure.
Hi, thanks. My name is Gary. I just want to thank you guys for a really interesting discussion. I want to go back to where we started about transparency, and I wanted to, it's a two-part question. My kind of interest in transparency, I've always been kind of mystified by FEC reports and how if we have software now that makes it easier, why shouldn't we reach a point, if the concern with campaign finance reform is influence, we can reach a point where we can show influence within 24 hours of influence being put on a member of Congress. So I guess my question is two parts. First, what do you guys think is the critical mass, or especially to John, what do you think the legislative outlook is on increasing transparency? And then secondly, what do you think issue advocacy groups from all stripes need to be doing to push that transparency agenda forward?
So on the FEC, Sunlight has long been a big supporter of the Center for Responsive Politics, which is the organization that makes all the FEC reports available. They recently released their entire database open source. You can download the whole thing if you want. If it's commercial, you have to pay them for it. But they open source their whole data set. Also, we've been doing a series of blog posts around redesigning government websites. And I think the first or second one that we did was fec.gov. And within 2 days of that blog post going up, and it was Sunlight designer Ali Felsky that put together the design for it, we got email and phone calls from the FEC commissioners saying, we'd love to talk to you about this. We ended up testifying at the FEC, and they have a big challenge in front of them because they have a very old system. For example, Clay, our labs director, if you look him up in the FEC database, his occupation is listed as technology con, right? Because at some point he was like a consultant or something, but they have such an old database that you can't have more letters than that, right? So that's the title that you get. It's actually COBOL, C-O-B-O-L, is the data format that they use, and it's from like 1982 or something. It's horrible. So they're working on fixing it, but it's going to take a while. So they're on board as far as making the technological changes that they have to. Now, as far as legislative changes to change how often you have to make reports, I think that's entirely possible. I mean, I think you saw on the right a fair amount of that concern coming out because a lot of Obama's fundraising came from people that are under the disclosure limit. So, I mean, that's a conversation that is suddenly open again, and also because the technology is there in order to make it happen. So I think that conversation has been reopened in a way that it hasn't been for a while. I'm not sure if it's likely to happen, but more likely than it has been.
Let's try to go through these questions. Do you have one more? Do we have time for one more or two? Okay, I'll do one more and then we can all grab coffee.
Hi, my name's Connor Kenny, and I wanted to get back to the astroturfing question. And, the fake op-ed letters are something that is obviously unethical. It's obviously something that somebody would be very embarrassed about if they're caught. But I don't think that's what we're really referring to when we talk about astroturfing. What we're really referring to is astroturf is fake grassroots. So it's purportedly grassroots action, bottom up, not top down, that is not. So I used to look into a bunch of advocacy groups that when you look at 501c3 or C4 organizations and you look at their financial disclosure records, they'll have their top financial donors itemized, but the names will be blacked out. And I remember one group during the Medicare drug debate was, I think it was called U.S. Senior or United Seniors Association, and it had 90% of their funding from one donor. Right. And we were able to figure out that it was pharma, but we didn't quite know it at the time. But they were presenting themselves as a grassroots seniors association that was, in favor of this drug bill that would be very good for farmers' clients. So I guess my question for the panelists is, where do you stand on the ethics of opaquely contributing to C3 or C4 advocacy groups without revealing your contributions, and especially those that have names that make them seem like, the National Association of Manufacturers is very clear who that is. Some of the other names may not.
It's a great question.
I guess I would just say that, I think that it's an excellent point. What we do by definition to some degree is top-down grassroots. We are bringing an issue to the attention of people and then inviting them to get involved. We consider that authentic and believe that that does not cross a line to the extent that we're saying, here we are, come help us if you're interested in this issue. On the transparency thing, our position is always that we have to disclose. We'd never get into a situation where we're advocating an issue and disguising the ultimate advocate. I think the one one thing that you can be hopeful about is that people who have got caught have paid a very, very high price. Sometimes maybe few don't get caught and are able to kind of pull it off. But I think the ones that do get caught, it really it's hugely damaging to be so I think there is sort of a sanction out there, or a risk you're taking by operating that way, that does diminish the amount of that's done. Would be my.
I agree with that. I guess to me the test, theoretically anyway, would be sort of the letter to the editor test that John described. Is that if you went back to these people and said, do you really support this? And they said yes, then to me that's okay, right? It's when they said
even if
no.
you ginned them up.
Ginned them up. It's
loaded term.
To me, it really is, it's going out to folks, again, for our experience, going out to folks and say, here's an issue, and we think you might care about this, because you are this or that. And then if they look at it and say, yeah, this is right, and they look at the site, and they go through the portal, and they take action, then that to me is okay. If you buy lists and just generate letters, that to me is
But you're asking about disclosure, right? Like funding?
And we discussed that fake people are bad, but what about fake organizations?
It's not a fake organization. They're entitled to free speech like anyone else. The issue is transparency, and we're all agreeing that so long as pharma discloses that they're behind that organization, what's the problem? They should be entitled to advocacy just like anybody else, and so long as money equals is viewed as a method of free speech, which who knows what the court will do and what Congress is up to, but there's nothing really wrong with that.
I wasn't saying there's anything wrong with that. I was saying there's something wrong, potentially, and I wasn't making a value judgment, actually, about funding organizations in order to have advocacy look like it's coming from someplace that is not you.
But would you disagree? Like, I think the point here is if you disclose, right?
There's a lot of advocacy organizations in D.C. that do not disclose their major
And
partners.
I think to Bill and Pat's point, if they don't disclose, aside from the letter scenario, which was bad, it's bad, without getting into pharma, some of these industries don't have huge favorable ratings, and potentially it's because of prior, examples where they engaged in behavior like that, right? Like that there's still a negative associated with it, as long as the watchdog groups and others can uncover when those instances happen. So it's not, and I don't know, John, if there's been, maybe there's a good note to add on. I don't know if it's been easier to get at that truth now, as opposed to 10 years ago when you were originally doing, well, maybe, is there a bill in work? What's Sunlight's position on that problem?
I think my response generally is that those lines are hard to draw. We can certainly, when you say, okay, it's fake when you see it, that's fine, but how do you legislate that? How do you make a rule about that? How do you treat them differently under the FEC? So Obama's not permitting lobbyists to get hired in his administration, right? And some public interest groups have come out and said they shouldn't count public interest lobbyists. And to me, the question is, how can you say who's operating in the public interest and who isn't? Everybody's going to say they're a public interest lobbyist. And I say that as someone who is a public interest lobbyist. Right? But how can you possibly draw that line is my question. How can you say if you name yourself, it has to be descriptive? Like that, it's just a question of what one could enforce. And I say that being totally sympathetic to your point, but the question is where could you have enforcement besides ethics and consequences for being dishonest?